welcome to this episode of the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And in today's episode, we'd like to discuss Wimbledon and recap both on the men's side and on the women's side. And to do this, we're going to start a little bit by discussing a couple of quotes from the finalists, Karolina Pliskova, as well as the champion, Ash Barty, and a couple of the quotes from their press conferences, as well as certain aspects of the match. And also talk about the men's final, in which Djokovic won his 20th Grand Slam title, tying, of course, Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal, in which he faced Matteo Berrettini in his first Grand Slam final. So, Brian, to get us started, why don't we present a couple of these quotes from the women's finalist and champion?
Sure. And let's start with the runner-up, Karolina Pliskova. For those of us who watched the match, obviously, Pliskova didn't get off to the start that she wanted, and she definitely discussed that in her press conference, losing the first 14 points. She also attributed some of that to Ash Barty playing very well at the opening of the match, right? So it wasn't 100% say nerves or whatever. But I think if we look at this from a tennis IQ or even a sports psych perspective, losing the first 14 points of the match, and she still could have won the set, right? Still could have won the match even. And so it tells you that you're never out of this type of thing. And I think that's what Pliskova realized. A player of her experience understands that it really doesn't matter if you lose the first 3 games by not winning any points. You can always come back from that, and so I thought that was really impressive, the way she did kind of get herself back into the set more or less, and then played a great second and then a really close third set. So I think, Josh, when we think of Pliskova, she's someone we've seen a lot of, but she's sort of under the radar about how good she is. She's been in the top 10 for a long time. I think, she was out of it maybe just before Wimbledon, but this result gets her back into the top 10. She's been a finalist at the U.S. Open, now a finalist at Wimbledon. And so she was asked about, does this result reinforce her belief in the ability to win one of these titles? And I think her answer was interesting, and we can compare this later to something that Novak Djokovic said with respect to self-belief as well. So her answer was, I would say, in terms of reinforcing your belief, that this is very important. It's not that I would never believe. Of course, me personally, with my game, with my team right now, with all the people which I really care about around me, and with my game, I always believe in that. But she shifted a little bit and then said, but I think many people, they don't believe. And I think she's probably right about that. Self-belief is such an important aspect of being mentally tough, of being a great competitor. And so I think it's really nice that I don't know about nice, but it's sort of insightful on her part to bring that up, because it is, as she mentions, that it can be difficult to maintain that self-belief, especially in a sport where there's always a winner and a loser, and even within a match, every point has a winner and a loser. So it can be difficult to maintain that self-belief, and it's such an important skill. So I thought it was really interesting that she talked more about that, that this result actually increased her belief going into the U.S. Open, and then understanding, hey, she's played a final there, so it's not impossible, and she'll just keep trying. So, what are your thoughts on self-belief, Josh, as a key component of mental toughness?
Yeah, well, it's definitely an essential component of mental toughness. I mean, we've talked before how the research certainly backs this up, that different research into mental toughness has shown that it's really an essential ingredient, among with other aspects, including confidence, including resilience, but this ability to believe that you are capable of winning, where it's not, you don't go into a match being so impressed or putting somebody else up on a pedestal. It's not saying not to respect your opponents, but it's that having that confidence that you are capable of winning, of getting the job done. And I also like from this quote how, she said, I think many people don't, they don't necessarily always believe that they could win. And she also says, of course, the game is not always, you can't always play well. So it's about finding that balance. And I think this is an important point because you want to, in my opinion, you want to go in with certain realistic expectations that, hey, it's not always going to be pretty. I'm not always going to feel great or play my best. But that doesn't mean that I am going to give up on those days. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to try to find a way. Maybe there's a plan B. Maybe I have to make adjustments. Maybe I have to just put in that time and find my game on that given day. But understanding that, hey, it's not always going to go well or be pretty, but I have to be able to figure it out on those days. And regardless of that, I still have that self-belief in myself and in my game to get the job done. Even on those off days, even on those days where you wake up on the wrong side of the bed, you have the tools, and those might be tools within your game. Those might be mental tools that you can use to get yourself to the finish line.
Yeah, that reminds me of the quote from Jack Nicklaus, the great golfer, won 18 majors, who talked about something called the art of playing badly well. And how, on those days where you're not playing your best, you don't have it physically, you have to use your mental and emotional game to help you compete. And what he said was that's what distinguished the greats from everybody else, was they were able to do that. And it's true. It's like, can you play poorly physically, but still keep yourself in the match, still believe and use what you have, right? And I'll often tell students, most people are playing badly, as opposed to playing badly well. And so I think that is an important part of being mentally tough, and recognizing that I think belief is what drives that. Belief and confidence, and maybe even experience that you've done these types of things before, that you have the ability to come through. I thought the other thing that was interesting from Karolina Pliskova was talking about the idea of knowing how to lose, which I think, in reading what she was saying, is really more about handling losses, being gracious about that, especially in a sport in which, like we said, there's always going to be a winner and a loser. And so she was asked, have you always known how to lose? How has that changed over your career? And she says, no, not always. I think that's something that you also have to learn. You have to know how to learn how to win, but you also have to learn how to lose. Those are things that definitely need to be learned. And I think where she was going with a lot of this was the idea of how does one behave after a loss? It is natural, of course, to be disappointed after a loss, but how do you behave out on the court when you lose? And I think actually this is an opinion, Josh. I think players today handle losing really well in comparison to the past. I think in past years, you would never see a player who lost stop and give autographs. And I think these days it's more the norm that you do see that happen. So I'm generally impressed with how today's players handle losing. I think in general they are very gracious about it. I think we see more camaraderie between the players, more empathy between the players about what's going on out there. Certainly from when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, professional tennis was a little different. There was I would say little camaraderie on the court. Some of the bigger names were much more adversarial in nature. But I really like the way players have developed in terms of this. And so I think Pliskova brought this up because she unexpectedly for herself, I think ended up crying on the court, which is not something she would normally do, not something she normally plans to do. She maybe planned to cry in her room, but it ended up happening out on the court. But I do think it's an interesting topic to talk about, knowing how to lose, but also knowing how to win, and doing both with grace and modesty and humility, and really recognizing that it's a reflection on your character as a player.
Definitely is a reflection on your character, and every loss and every win to an extent. There are teachable moments and there are learning opportunities there.
Yeah.
So viewing losses in the right way as stepping stones and as important milestones to the improvement process is very important, as well as how you conduct yourself, as you were talking about. So yeah, I think it takes a certain type of maturity to understand that. Where I don't think most players, as they start to compete and they start to play tournaments and they care about winning, oftentimes it does take time to learn how to lose in the right kind of way. Um, I think, especially for players that reach the highest levels of the game, uh, most players have been at the top of their region at the very least, and oftentimes at the top of their country in the rankings since they were a young age, which
Yeah.
means they were doing a lot of winning and probably a lot less losing in comparison, or less first round losses or blowout losses or anything like that. And then all of a sudden, players are playing at the professional ranks, where, as we've talked about in the past, it's a grind, and nobody goes through that unscathed. There are times where maybe you go through a losing streak of first round losses, or you would take a really bad loss, and in order to reach that highest level, you have to be able to deal with those moments and turn the other cheek at times and move keep going and learn from them ultimately, so that they don't continue to happen. So I think this is a really important point. I think it shows a lot of maturity from her, and probably a big reason why she has been able to reach this final for the first time, because of that maturity, because of that understanding of learning how to lose, but also maybe a greater understanding of her game in general.
Yeah, and who she is as
Yep.
a human being. And that brings me to the last quote I wanted to discuss, with respect to the women's final. So Ash Barty was asked about, she's respected as someone who's humble, kind, and a nice person, and why is that important to her? And so I think I'll read her whole answer to this, because I think we can also tie it back to a previous episode that we had. So she said, "I think I've just tried to live by my values that my parents instilled in me. I mean, it's more important to be a good person than it is a good tennis player. So I think that's always my priority, is making sure that I'm a good human being. Being able to learn from my parents and my siblings, my family, was a massive part of my upbringing. I was just extremely lucky that I was able to have an opportunity to learn how to play the game of tennis. But I think being a good human being is absolutely my priority every single day." So that reminded me of our interview with Brian Barker. I think that was maybe episode 2, and how he tried as a young player to focus on being the best person that he could be, and that was also a means of reducing the amount of pressure that he feels. And I know that Brian continues to work with players on that particular philosophy, um, to help them be the best people they can be. And he's very invested and engaged in their careers, and as a way of reducing the pressure. So this, I think, what Pliskova was saying about being gracious and handling losses really translates here as well. It's about, can we not only be great tennis players, but can we be great human beings? And that's where I think I'm really impressed with many of the top players in today's men's and women's game, that they have embraced that. And if we typically talk about pro athletes being role models, there are probably pros and cons to that, right? Because they are human beings. But we're lucky, I think, in the sport of tennis that we have some really fantastic players who can be role models for behavior on the court and off the court.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we've talked in the past about Nadal and Federer, as well as Serena and a number of the champions. And I mean, Djokovic, Barty would be a great example too. And how they conduct themselves is really an example of how all all tennis players and people should be conducting themselves on and off the court. And I think they've embraced the fact that they're under the microscope, they're in the spotlight, and that people are watching, kids are watching, and not that they haven't made mistakes, but understanding that they have a great opportunity here to instill some of these values that are really important in terms of having the type of character skills that will help you on court, help you to win more in terms of, maybe things like your work ethic and things of that nature, but are what will help you in life. And so I really like that she touched on that. I mean, I think she comes across as very, very likable, very personable. And yeah, this definitely does relate to that conversation with Brian Barker. So if you haven't listened to that, definitely worth checking out. Our first interview, and definitely uh, a conversation where, yeah, he really stresses that importance of doing your best and trying to be a good person and not focusing too much on that result and that outcome. So I think that's a really important point and definitely a lot of overlap there.
Yeah. So let's move then to Novak Djokovic.
Yep.
And I know there were certain things from his press conference, Josh, that you really wanted to point out. I mean, there's we can put a link to the transcript, but there's a lot of gold stuff in there for any of us. And I think when we listen to Novak Djokovic or read his press conference transcripts, there almost always are some good nuggets for the mental game. I think of all of the players, I think he talks about it the most. I think, Rafa maybe talks about it the second most in terms of those things, but there's always some great stuff. And let's face it, whether you're in the Novak Djokovic fan camp or not, he's the number one player in the world by a long stretch at the moment.
It's true. No, I mean, going into this tournament, he was the clear favorite, especially with Nadal out. Federer recently have come back from his surgery. So yeah, he was the clear favorite, and I would agree that he's created a lot of space between him and the rest of the pack, and has also won the 3 Grand Slams at this point. And I know we were talking off air that his Olympic participation is in doubt over some of the restrictions there, but he is certainly has a chance for the Grand Slam, the calendar Grand Slam this year, and perhaps even the Golden Grand Slam with an Olympic victory if he chooses to play and ends up victorious. So it has definitely created a lot of space. And no, a quote. So after his title over Matteo Berrettini, a quote from his press conference really stood out to me, and it's actually an extended quote. So I'll read portions of it, but I think there's really a lot of valuable nuggets here, and he's definitely a person who has embraced a lot of different aspects of the mental game. I think which will shine brightly. It will be pretty clear from this quote, but also his book. His book, Serve to Win, which was a lot about his diet and going gluten-free and his transformation in terms of his diet, but also talked about a lot of other things, including aspects of the mental game. Talks about visualization, talks about mindfulness, how he utilizes some of these mental tools. So he's certainly someone who has publicly embraced a lot of aspects of the mental game. But yeah, as it relates to this quote, the question was, and this is actually the final question of the press conference. The question was, when you're playing a match like that and you're going through the pressure moments, do you think at all about the history aspect? Again, he's going for his 20th title to tie Nadal and Federer, something he's been chasing his entire career. Um, or are you thoroughly in the moment? And what is your thought process like in those critical points? And he says, well, I think it's a constant battle on the court to stay present, to stay in the now, so to say. Oftentimes you're experiencing emotions and thoughts that would take you in the past, regret for not playing a certain ball or a certain point that you wanted to play that you could have played, or the anticipation for the future. What if, what's going to happen? It's really a constant work of trying to bring those thoughts into the present moment. I feel like that's the biggest work that I have. Probably any athlete, particularly individual athletes. When you're present, experiencing, and seeing things in a very simple way, it's a tennis match, it's only the next point, you're there, then you're able to perform your best. So I think really a lot of valuable stuff there. Actually, I would say a lot of overlap to a lot of themes that we've talked about in the past, that necessity and goal of being present as often as possible and not getting caught in the past, being upset about why you played a point a certain way or why the score is the way it is. We're also thinking about the future, thinking about the what ifs, and he really touched on that and says that that is the most important thing. So I think that that certainly says a lot, um, and that you want to, that to me that we want to set this out as our goal or as one of our goals to be to most of the time to be present, to remember that that next point, as Brian has said oftentimes, that next point is the most important point. It's not whatever just happened. It's not that point. It's not match point that might be around the corner. It's that next point. And he touches on this too, that it's a tennis match. It's only the next point. You're there, then you're able to perform your best. So if we can stay present, if we can focus on playing that next point as well as we possibly can, that's how we can give ourselves that best possible chance to perform well, regardless of the outcome, regardless of what might happen.
Yeah, and I think the part what you just ended on is the part that really stood out to me, and perhaps simplifying the whole process down, right? Because he says seeing things in a very simple way. Hey, it's just a tennis match. It's only the next point, and it doesn't really matter how we got here. It doesn't matter what's going to happen in 5 minutes from now. It's can you just simplify things down? This is just a tennis match, and this is just a point, and
Yeah.
I'm going to play it, and then you go from there. I love the idea of simplify. We live in New England, so Henry David Thoreau, philosopher, um, from Concord, Massachusetts, and wrote Walden. Talks about simplifying things and how that is always a good choice. And I think it's the same thing in a sport like tennis. The more that you can simplify things down to the essentials, and then focus on those things and being in the present moment, it certainly helps. And when he talks like this, it reminds me of those match points he faced against Federer in the 2019 final. When Federer was serving at 40-15. My guess is that in that moment, Novak was able to just sort of play this point. And he did the same thing. I think you brought this up, that time at the US Open when same thing, Federer serving 40-15 match point, and he slaps a forehand winner.
Like the 2011 semifinals, the US
Yeah.
Open. Yeah, I
remember. And so that's a good example of just putting yourself in the moment and not really caring about what the score is or how you got there. You're able to just play, and he does that better than anybody.
Absolutely. And not to get too off topic here, but Brian and I were talking off air about the Hall of Fame Open. That's our tournament going on right now in Newport, Rhode Island. And I was talking about a match in the qualifying between Ryan Harrison and Chris Eubanks that was 7-6, 6-7, 7-6, with the second set being 18-16 in the tiebreaker. And throughout the match, Chris Eubank saved 12 match points before finally succumbing to the 13th. And what I noticed while watching is that on each of these match points, he was playing his game. He was going for his shots. He was playing aggressively, perhaps even more aggressively. So I think that comes back to this point that you're making with Djokovic that, hey, on match point, on any point, are we able to put aside everything else and really focus on being present, focus on this point, focus on what's important now, and try to, you know, put aside that outcome of what might happen here. Hey, what if I miss? What if he aces me? What if I get aced? Who ultimately that's not what's important now. What's important is, hey, what's my plan? We talked about we've talked many times about our routines in between points. Can we prepare during that preparation stage, that third stage in the process? Can we prepare and maybe think about that first shot or that first and second shot that we want to play and how we want to set that point up? And regardless of if it works out or not, are we doing everything in our power to set ourselves up best for success? Another thing I liked about this quote, Brian, is he talks about, again, on this piece of mindfulness or piece of trying to stay present. He says, I feel like if you're constantly divided between past and future, it's difficult to keep the quality of tennis that you really want. That's usually when players get tense, fold under pressure. It happens to me. Of course, I mean, I've been very fortunate to be so strong in the decisive moments of the biggest tournaments throughout my career. I lost also quite a bit of finals of Grand Slams where I felt like I was close to winning, but then I folded. As Michael Jordan used to say, I failed, I failed, I failed. That's why I succeeded in the end. Again, not a direct quote, but we've actually talked about this same quote, where Michael Jordan has said, hey, I've throughout my career, I've missed such and such so many shots. A certain number of time I've been counted on to make the game-winning shot and missed. And that, for those reasons, again, not a direct quote here, for those reasons, that's why I succeed. And he talks about this, this is a learning process. It's a learning curve. And through these experiences, through failure, through losses, you're able to improve and you're able to ultimately win more. And I like that he's tying this aspect of staying present to that process, because again, if that goal is to be present as often as possible, we know that you're not going to do that 100% of the time. It's easier said than done. It's always that process of going from being lost in thought or going from being distracted to coming back to that present moment, which to me is really what mindfulness is that constant coming back to that present moment from thinking about the past or the future. But to me, that quote from him is that he views some of his past experiences of being tense under pressure as maybe moments where he wasn't being present, where he was, caught up in the moment, caught up thinking about the future, and learned from those experiences. And through learning from those experiences, that has made him the player that he is today, where he has 20 Grand Slams and the most weeks at number one, and is making the case as strong as ever of being the greatest of all time. And we're not going to get into our thoughts on that, but certainly is making that case as strong as he ever has.
No doubt. And I think when you talk about that learning process, Josh, it brings it back to what you said with respect to handling losses the right way.
Yep.
And that is when you handle losses the right way, you're able to look at them and learn from them and count them as experiences that can help you to grow and become a great player. If we think about the career arc of Novak Djokovic, for a long period of time, among the top three, he was three.
Yep.
And he suffered losses to both of those guys as well as to some other players. And he's been able to internalize all of that, learn from it. He mentioned, I think, after even one Australian Open final, maybe 2012, where he actually expressed some gratitude to Federer and Nadal for forcing him to raise his game in many ways to become the player that he really wanted to. because if they hadn't done that, he wouldn't be the player he is today. And that's also an excellent viewpoint of how we look at our fellow competitors. They are not always just standing between you and goals. And in fact, they're pushing you to be better. So if you really want to, if you want to beat somebody, it's not about necessarily just beating them. It's about, all right, how are you going to raise your standard? How are you going to train harder, work harder, and so forth? And so that's another aspect of his career that I find impressive, and why I think at the moment you would have to say he's probably going to end up with the most Grand Slams of the three of them. In terms of wear and tear, he's in the best condition of the three of them. That's not to say that, Rafael Nadal can't win some more French Opens. He obviously could. And he has I would say, a legitimate shot at winning the U.S. Open. But Novak Djokovic, I think, is going to be the favorite at least 3 out of the 4 every year now. And now he's proven he can also win in Paris. So he's obviously learned a ton here through this whole process. And I think it ties back to knowing how to lose properly and grow from it.
Absolutely. No, he's again, I come back to this word of maturity. I think that has definitely come through in this interview and in general. Just I think in the past, perhaps, and this is just my opinion here, perhaps what's turned off fans at certain moments has been maybe a feeling of not that same level of behavior that we've come to really respect Nadal and Federer from. We've they've been just such amazing role models throughout the years, and maybe at times he's had moments where has not lived up to that standard in certain ways. But I think this interview, as well as his um, as well as the way he now presents himself, I'd say over the past few years has really shown to me a lot of maturity in terms of how he presents himself, in terms of the level of respect that he gives to his opponents, as well as his greatest rivals, which are really Nadal and Federer historically. Um, and I think that's really impressive. And I think I think he deserves all the credit that he's been getting recently, and perhaps more. I mean, I think everything that he's done, the way that he has gone from, as you said, Brian, somebody that was spent a lot of time in that number 3 position behind Federer and Nadal, where they were having these epic finals, these Wimbledon finals and finals different places, and winning year after year. Nadal winning in Paris as well as other Grand Slams, and Federer really dominating the much of the 2000s, and him being at number 3, and rather than saying, okay, I have a great career here, I'm one of the top players in the world, thinking, okay, what can I do better? What's going to help take me to that next level? And I really would suggest that book, Serve to Win, by him, because it really talks about that process. It was really partially random how it happened, where he was cramping on court, and he tells the story of a doctor. I think it was a Serbian doctor, saw it on TV and reached out to him and sort of led him on this journey where he changed his diet, he changed a lot of different aspects of his lifestyle, and he credits those changes um, to ultimately bring him over that hub to get him to the number 1 position, where over the last decade he has really won more Grand Slams than any other player by a decent margin. So kudos to him, and had certainly showed a lot of maturity and a lot of growth, I would say, over the in recent years. And it's an interesting position now on the men's side, where there's 3 players with 20 Grand Slams, and I think if you look back, at the end of Sampras's career, it would have been um, almost impossible to think that 3 players would surpass his total of 14 Grand Slams by 6 Grand Slams each, and win 20. I mean, that's That's 60 Grand Slams between the three of them. That's 15 years total of Grand Slams just by three people. So certainly impressive by all three of them. But regarding Djokovic, has certainly shown through this interview and through how he's presented himself that he truly has a grasp of that importance of staying present and really learning from defeats and from experiences that you'd like to replay. So, yeah, I said a lot there.
Well, he's come a long way, I think, since you mentioned the retirements. He retired, I think, one time famously against Andy Roddick at the Australian Open with the Heat, and Roddick, somewhat mocked him for him at the time. And now look where he is. There's one other aspect of this transcript, this press conference that I'd like to go over, Josh, because I think it does touch on another important feature of mental toughness. And so there was a question about, it's a bit of a leading question, I think. Do you consider yourself the greatest male tennis player of the Open era? Do you think one of you three will actually break Margaret Court's record of 24 single slams at one stage? And so Djokovic's answer, I really want to focus just on this first sentence here. I consider myself best, and I believe that I am the best. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking confidently about winning slams and making history. So one might hear somebody say like, hey, I'm the best. And perhaps you're thinking, well, that's a bit cocky, maybe a bit arrogant and so forth. But it immediately made me think of a paper that was written in the early 2000s about what is mental toughness. And that paper was a study of elite athletes and what they believe mental toughness is and what are like the important attributes of it. And one of those top important attributes was this idea of having this unshakable self-belief that you are better than your opponents and that there are things that distinguish you and make you better than your opponents. And so when we think about this, there's sort of this line between, say, confidence and cockiness, or confidence and arrogance. And Djokovic, he's on that line, but he's on the right side of it. He's got this self-belief that he is the best. And that serves him well in big moments. And in fact, after the 2019 Wimbledon win against Federer, he even said it in that press conference that when he was down in the fifth and struggling mentally in the fifth, he had to remind himself that he was the better player and that he deserved to be there in that moment. And so this is a really key aspect of self-belief. And the one piece that I like from that particular paper or study is the word unshakable. Now, for all of us, is it really ever truly unshakable? Probably not. But can we get it to a place where it's, unshakable 98% of the time? Then you can go out there and believe that you're always going to win. You may not always be able to pull it off. But I think when we look at that line between confidence and arrogance and why Djokovic is on the right side of it, is because he always works really hard. Everything he's doing off the court is to be the best. He doesn't just assume I am the best, therefore I don't need to work. He's like, yeah, I'm the best, and everything I do is about keeping me here and proving that this is where I should be. So I thought that was a really interesting quote. He does go on to say about the greatest of all time, says, but whether I'm the greatest of all time or not, I leave that debate to other people. And then he gets into a little bit how it's so difficult to compare different eras of tennis, which he's 100% right. So yeah, those are debates for other people to talk about, who's the greatest of all time, and whether that's even a valuable discussion, I think is debatable in itself. But is Novak Djokovic the best player right now? Absolutely. He knows it. and that's actually, I think, a part of his success.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important for everybody listening, all tennis players, all athletes out there, um, to try to embody at least a piece of that.
Yeah,
That you want to have you want your self-belief to be unshakable, in that regardless of what's going on in your life, regardless of what's going on in that particular day, that you believe that you could do it. And to me, it's a lot about believing that you can figure it out that you can figure it out as you go. Um, that you have the tools, you have the ability to manage the ups and downs, the curveballs that life can throw at you, the curveballs that a match might throw at you, and that you are equipped and that you can be resilient. Because to me, I come back to, it's not always going to be easy, it's not always pretty, but having that ability and your having that belief that you can figure it out, that you um, that you can manage the situation, is what can be the difference maker. So no, I really like this, and I feel that yeah, he is, yeah, we can put that historical conversation to the side right now, or even as you said, even whether it's helpful to have that conversation or important. But um, yes, certainly an understanding that um, yeah, that you need to be able to believe in yourself to this point that you believe that you're capable of winning. And to me, that really comes back to capable of dealing with the ups and downs, capable of, let's say you're in a match and your opponent starts playing unbelievable tennis. You know that, hey, this is going to have a start and this is going to have a finish. This won't last forever. I'm not going to get in my own head and think, oh, it's just not my day today. Or on the other side of things, maybe you start off, really slow, like we've seen from Djokovic in this match against Berrettini, like perhaps we saw from Pliskova in the match against Barty. But you maintain that self belief in yourself and know that, hey, I I've started off slow before. I know how to handle this. I need to find my rhythm here. But rather than getting caught up in the emotions or the frustrations of that moment, you're able to slow things down perhaps and think clearly and still have that self belief in yourself to find a way to get the job done.
yeah, you don't panic.
Yep.
You can kind of stay more in the moment, right? We were just talking about being more in the present, and I think that's all connected. If you believe you can win, then you know that, well, just one point at a time. I find my game, I can get back into it. I think there's always this optimism that you're going to find your game at some point
Yep.
when you have that total self belief, and and you keep doing it, or you do as Jack Nicklaus said, you just start using the mental and emotional skills just to compete with whatever you've got on this given day. And so, but a lot of that comes from that self belief. And I think when we don't have that, when we don't have that confidence, that's when panic sets in, negative self talk, start to criticize yourself, start to doubt who you are as a player or your abilities, and things can go off the rails pretty quickly after that. So, and again, another great example. I think that's why I love looking at these press conferences that Djokovic has, because he always has some really good things for us to learn from, because he's not afraid to be human
Yep.
about this stuff. He admitted that he was nervous uh, prior to the match, felt like he played a little too defensively maybe in that first set, etc. Um, you know, I guess I feel like we don't necessarily get all that kind of stuff from everybody else, and it's great to hear how he deals with it and overcomes it. And here he is again. Um, he's got three Grand Slams this year, looking for number 4 in New York.
Yeah, looking for number 4. Also looking to break the record of the men's record. We should I should say. But yeah, looking to break that record and to surpass Federer and Nadal, a feat that maybe most wouldn't have imagined even just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, for sure. So that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's show, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for Josh or me, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check out our Instagram page. Thanks again, and we will talk to you soon in our next episode.